I encourage people to continue having the difficult conversations, and in a thoughtful way and in a way that is understanding and empathetic to what the families are going through.
Welcome to the podcast, Erin. I'm so glad that you are here. We have a lot to dive into. We have a lot to talk about today, and I want everybody in our community to get to know you and to learn a little bit about what we're going to be talking about at the symposium. But also, really, I have a lot of questions for you, and I'm really curious about you. So would you like to introduce yourself and share a little bit about who you are?
Of course. And thank you so much for having me. This is, it's really exciting to be able to try and get some word out there. As you know, and I think you've mentioned before, it can feel sort of isolating in this field at times. So it's nice to feel like I'm actually going to be able to have contact with people and further my area that I'm reaching beyond just the Northeast and particularly north of Boston. So yes, I'm Erin Buckley, and I've been a comms for 31 years. I had to sit down and do a lot of math to figure that out. I was in the Boston College program before it became the UMass Boston program. And I went through for the orientation mobility and also rehab teaching specialist. I started off working right out of school. I went to the Carroll Center, where I worked with people who had vision and had lost it for the most part. In the summers, we did have programs with school-age kids, but I feel like that was a really good introduction and an interesting dynamic, working with people who had vision at one point and then lost it. Then I went on to work at the Veterans Administration, and I was part of their initial program for what's called BROS. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but Blind Rehab Outpatient Specialist. So it's people that are coming from their blind rehab training centers and going home and then trying to apply all that they learned in their home setting. So we had local people that would go to veterans' homes and try to, help them to use all that they learned while they were there. And then I started working in the schools once I had my kids. And that's one thing I love about this field, is that you can kind of adjust to what your life needs are. So my kids were younger and I started working in the schools, and I've never stopped doing that ever since. So I love it. And I don't know if you want me to go right now into the work history from schools.
Sure. Whatever you want to go into, whatever you want to share at this beginning part is totally fine.
Okay. So I started working in the schools with kids, and I love the fact that you can see them in their school settings and get to know all the team members. And as any of you know, it can be overwhelming. The teacher, the paraprofessionals in the classrooms, the secretaries, PTs, OT speech, all the different people that are working with these students. And of course, the TVIs, those were actually the easiest for me because we have, a lot of overlap or try to get together. But working with these big teams, and then you go to another school and you start all over again with their teams there, and everyone does things differently. And so it's a big adjustment. I also didn't mention I did some private contracting in the schools as well, for what it's worth. But what I started to notice along the way is that you don't have a lot of contact with families when you're seeing the kids in schools. And even if they have, parent-teacher conferences, we're not invited to those. And so you have to really make that happen. Sometimes in the schools, they also tend to have a unwritten or an unspoken, I think, thoughts about contacting. I'll oftentimes hear, well, no, usually the teacher will do the contacting. You can tell the teacher what you want the notice to be sent home, and they can try to get the information. And I understand they're trying to make it less overwhelming, and they're not having everybody contact them, phone calls and loads of emails and whatnot, but it's so personal, the aspect of blindness. And I know that's our field, so that's the only thing I'm thinking of, and there are other disabilities that I'm sure are equally personal, but I find that it's a big emotional issue, having to put a cane in somebody's hand and have them go out in front of the kids in their school or in front of their neighborhoods and actually hold this cane out. It's something that they're not accustomed to and maybe don't even really ever want to do because maybe they thought people didn't know that they had a visual impairment. Maybe they could hide that. And the more I was in the field, the more I said, uh, this is something, it's a big issue. If people don't know, how can they help you? How can they understand? And then how can our students get where they need to go in terms of having the courage, excuse me, having the confidence if you're trying to hide something big? Does that make sense?
Oh my gosh, it makes complete sense. And I actually have like a little bit of a deeper question for you. You mentioned that you worked at the Carroll Center and you worked at centers where people would come, they would live there with the bros. For some reason, I'm gonna mess that up a lot, but I already did. But with that organization, and then they would go home. And I worked at a residential school, and I remember seeing the parents like 3 times a year at drop off, parent weekend, and then pick up. And my friends who were itinerant would text with parents and they had a great rapport relationship. Now, I will say I'm extremely introverted. And as I've gotten older, I've become more extroverted. But at the time, this was also a friend who was very extroverted and I was very introverted. And I couldn't delineate the difference between, is it just that I work at this place and I don't see the parents very often because they don't come and pick them up, or is it because you're extroverted and I'm introverted and it would be the same? But I find now, even working in as contract, I do have more communication with parents. But I kind of would like to hear from you, since you've also worked in both kind of settings. Do you feel like the parental relationship between O&M and the parents was better or worse, just in general, within the school system or within the centers?
Oh, that's an interesting question I hadn't really thought of. So, I mean, I would say definitely what you said, that the parents aren't there when you're in a center, right? And actually the centers that I worked at were typically for adults. And in the summertime it was kids, but again, it was a 6-week program. So they would get dropped off 1 week and then 6 weeks later get picked up, and there really wasn't any chance to be interactive. So actually 0 interaction. I would say, and this was years ago, but I don't think we would have ever reached out to parents, which is a shame. And now in the schools, maybe there is more. We do have their emails and we do have phone numbers and we can reach out at times. And it does depend also on the school. I think some schools are more open, and the smaller, maybe school where there's a really tight knit team, it could be one or the other. It could be that they allow and think it's great to call, or they might say, hey, let's just keep it professional. And that's another thing. Cell phone numbers, texting, all that stuff. We are now in a time when everyone's nervous about, having boundaries, the right boundaries. And sometimes a close connection is difficult to have if you're really worried about boundaries.
Yeah. And then of course there's just sharing your boundaries up front. Like I tell parents I won't respond after dinner time. And then if I can, I will, but sometimes I don't. But I get what you're saying, because it can be very tricky, especially if the parents are very litigious or the school district is scared of due process.
Yes. That becomes a bigger and bigger issue, I think, as we go along. It was not so much an issue or a worry years ago. But so basically, I'll tell you where the idea of the survey came in, if that's okay.
Yeah, why don't you explain what the survey is, how it came about, and all of that?
So what I've noticed in working with these kids, there's a particular bunch of kids that were troubling me. High school kids, a handful, but meaning a small number, but they were also a handful. They were just angry and resistant and never wanted a cane. And when you knew they actually need it, and they're going to need it in their future, and that in the school setting is the time when our services are available. And I know that situation, but they're not as easily available. And you're going to learn the majority of what you need at school. Tell me if you agree with that. But that's my understanding.
Yeah, especially in O&M,
Yes.
100%.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, though, unfortunately, but
Mhm.
currently, yes.
Yeah. So it was a constant topic of conversation at meetings, and how do we reach them? What do we do? And this one just will not carry a cane, will not talk about a cane. And you also have to recognize it's a really touchy um, issue, and we're the ones who have to do it. It's difficult, to be the one at a meeting, say with a younger student, and it's coming down the line. And I like to just try to float the idea at one meeting and let it sit until the next year, and then bring it up again, and try to get the parents used to the idea. And sometimes you wonder, is the approach of just ripping off the Band-Aid better? But I'm not sure about that. It's an issue. It's an emotional time. It's an emotional topic. And then a particular student that I had, that several of them, I'll be honest, they already had some kind of like mental health issues going on. And so that's going to add to it. And one in particular recently that actually is the reason why I started having a survey. And it was because it's a student who has, the acuities are bad, are like 2,400. And they believe, because she's been in elementary school and the mother has worked in the schools, believe that she just doesn't need that cane. And we could say, knowing what she can see, that she's going to need this. And she's educated, this mother, and she's trying to do everything that she can that's the right thing for her child. And I really wanted to reach her. And I felt like maybe something like this, where she could hear about what has been successful for other kids, kids who are like her own daughter, maybe this could reach her. So this is where I came up with it. It was really kind of like a last minute thing that I said, I have now in contact with a lot of people that I used to teach, and now they have a lot of friends that have gone through programs, and I thought maybe I can get the word out. Can I just kind of pull some information from you? One particular student too, who I also knew was going to need a cane, and I, sometimes you have a kid that you say, oh, it's going to happen, that something bad is going to happen for him to say, oh, now I'll use the cane. And so it did happen. And thankfully it wasn't getting hit by a car. And I was so worried about that. It was bumping into a couple poles and spilling coffee all over him, and, having a bloody nose, that type of thing. So anyways, these are the people that I reached out to. They have answered my survey. I'm trying to get the word out further and further. Um, I am putting it out there still, because I would love to have, the more responses, the better. But basically the survey is about, what did you take advantage of when you were in school? And I start with basic things about what's your eye condition and what age that you started with the eye condition. And but then I went into, what services did you get in school? In starting in, when did you get mobility? Was it elementary, middle, high school? TVI services, elementary, middle, or high school? And then going on to, were you resistant, and what were you feeling at the time? How were you, what did you think about the services? Did your parents, what do they think about it? How was their response to it? And the open response part of it is the part that I feel I got the most information from, because and many people said, I don't really have anything, but the ones that did answer, you got a good view into what was going on with them. And I feel like it was really helpful. Um, so yeah, I'm thinking, how do I reach the parents? How do I reach other students? How do I best provide a service for them? So yeah, I just wanted to reach out to the people who had actually lived this life and done these things. And and I asked, one of my questions is, how could your mobility specialist do things differently or better? And what do you remember specifically? Is there a particularly good experience, a particularly bad experience in mobility? And I'm just curious what people think. And I said, I told the ones that I did know, I'm not gonna have to know who said it, and if it's something that was me, I don't care. It's no, I'm not gonna be bothered by anything, that if I did anything that they felt wasn't quite the right thing, I can handle that.
Yeah. So I love the fact that you put out the survey and you asked people for their input. So the survey itself, is that given to the teacher or the person with the visual impairment? Like, who fills it out?
The person with the visual impairment fills it out, and it's actually, I made it for people who have already graduated high school because I want to hear about their experience when they were in high school and how they've done since then. Hoping to make a correlation between the services that they got and the the potential of what they were able to do afterwards.
Yeah.
And so it's done online, and I think I did notice that I could print it out and you could fill it in or check boxes and all that, but I really only have it as something that you fill out online and then it's just automatically submitted to me. I use Google Forms, which is very easy actually.
Yep. And very accessible. There were many years where I had like younger adolescents and into the teenage years.
Mhm.
That was basically my caseload. And I found that, a lot of people think that students with multiple impairments are the hardest population. Was not the case for me whatsoever. My most difficult population were low vision teenage students
Yes.
because they had the biggest uphill battle, and they knew that I had never lived that life and I had never had those battles. And so it was really hard for me to say, like, I know what you're going through, because I didn't know what they were going
Right.
through.
Right.
Being a teenager is hard enough as it is.
Yes.
Going through those grief cycles, plus all the hormones, plus the fact that a lot of our degenerative eye conditions, they deteriorate rapidly during the teenage years because of
Mhm.
puberty. So
Right.
you have all of those things going on. And actually, for a few years on my professional development, you sit down with your boss at the end of the year and you tell your boss what you want to learn about the next year. It
Mhm.
was that specifically. And
Interesting.
yeah, because I just couldn't figure it out. And I worked at Cinderella's Castle. Everybody used a cane. There were like 150 students with visual impairments. You are included.
Mhm.
Like, these are your people. And I still could not get them to use a cane.
Wow. And
And
I'm going to add to that too, is that I totally agree with you on the fact that the low vision kiddos are the hardest because they can sneak by without having to be seen with a cane. And they don't want, how it is, middle school, high school, you do not want to stand out. You just want to blend in with everybody else. And the aspect of a lot of kids are getting their licenses and they're not. And that's another big grief process. So there's a lot going on, and it makes perfect sense to me, but it has really been on my mind for some time. And how can we do this better? So
yeah,
I hope that the results of the survey will be able to help in some way. I'm not even sure, but still I want to seek better ways of reaching that population because they're really needing it.
yeah. Were there any other things that you wanted to share with our audience today? Any other ways that they can take a step forward into becoming better O&M specialists?
Hmm. I guess something that I've had to become more comfortable with over time is to have the difficult conversations. We're put in that position with families who maybe want to believe and to see that maybe their child isn't going to need as much help as they seem like they could. Maybe they don't need a cane because then they won't have to be as different. Maybe they will be able to do all these things. And we want them to be able to do these things, and it can be very hard to have the conversation to say that we aim for them to have the independence and to have the skills, but that the cane is going to be a necessary part of that. And eh, there are times, I'm sure you've seen it, where that is just what the parents do not want to hear. So I encourage people to continue having the difficult conversations, and in a thoughtful way and in a way that is understanding and empathetic to what the families are going through, but that we still have to hold our ground a little bit gently.
Yeah, catch more flies with honey than vinegar.
That's my theory too.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Erin. It has been an absolute joy and pleasure to have you with us. And
Thank
I
you
can't
for having
wait
me.